Hello once again. How's your week so far? How's it treating you? Welcome to another crime dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So yeah, that's what I talk about here. If you like true crime and you also want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should totally subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. Yes, I'm still rocking the Halloween background, alright? Because Halloween is a mood, alright? It's more than a holiday. No, really, I'm just super lazy, but I'll update it for December. But yeah, it's my birthday month, and yeah, I've got some pumpkins and stuff, so yeah, why not? It's still on theme. Now, welcome to part 2 of the Andrea Yates case. Yes, thank you so much for indulging me. I know it's a really well-known case, but again, I've never been able to do a deep, thorough dive into it, so yeah, it's a birthday present to myself. That's what I did. I just celebrated my birthday. Didn't really do much. I don't really care. Just kind of sat around and chilled and, hung out. What do you guys do for your birthday? Are you the party type where you go out and do something fun and have a big old get together? Or are you more on the chill side? Let me know. All right, and like I just said, welcome to part 2 of the Andrea Yates case. In this part, we will of course be getting into the deaths of the children, so yeah, be forewarned about that. We are going to talk about their murders. We will also be getting into the aftermath, the media surrounding it, the response by Rusty and Andrea's family, the public, just a bunch of stuff to get into. Her trials, There's so much to get into. And there's so much to get into that we're just gonna dive right in, alright? So if you will remember in part 1, right, went over Andrea, who she was, how she met her husband Rusty, and then we went into their life together as a married couple. They had about 5 kids in 7 years, so Andrea was pregnant quite a lot, dealing with the children a lot. We talked about her first real mental break in adulthood, which was after the birth of her 4th son, Luke. And we went into, her numerous trips to the mental facilities, her ups and downs, how Rusty was handling it. Remember, he was sort of not taking it as seriously as you would like. He was more anxious to get Andrea out of the facilities. And then if you will remember, we ended with the last treatment facility that she would enter before the events of today's case, the Devereux Treatment Center. And she was under the care of Dr. Mohammed Saeed, remember? And we went into him, how according to some who worked with, at least one nurse who worked with him, wasn't the best. All right, certainly wasn't the type of doctor or personality that Andrea really needed, but nonetheless, that is who Andrea dealt with. And we ended with her second entry into Devereux. All right, remember she had ups and downs, and she was released from Devereux, but then she really dissolved, so Rusty took her back. All right, and that's kind of where we ended with. And specifically the last thing we talked about was how Dr. Saeed, even though there are conflicting notes in his file on Andrea, right, where he would say in his notes that she was improving, but yet notes from nurses and other staff who observed her, not so much. And we ended with Dr. Saeed recommending that Andrea be discharged and put on partial hospitalization, PHP. If you remember, that's where you spend the day in the hospital and go home at night. And Andrea wanted to be discharged, and Dr. Saeed was pretty okay with discharging her and putting her on PHP. So we'll pick up from there. So we'll open up on the date that we left off with in part 1 last week, May 14th, 2001, all right? And Rusty is on his way to visit Andrea at the Devereux Treatment Center, all right? So it's evening. So that evening, when Rusty arrived at Devereux to see Andrea, he said that he was quite surprised and shocked to see her waiting for him at the front lobby with her bags packed. She was ready to go home. Now, according to him, a bunch of the nurses and staff that were right there all looked ashamed, according to him, wouldn't really look him in the eye. And this was as they told him that their insurance had only approved a 10-day stay, all right? And so she had to be discharged. Even though, according to Rusty, it came off to him as if they were not really comfortable in doing that. So that's what Rusty said he observed and experienced. Andrea was discharged with more prescriptions. Dr. Saeed had prescribed her 2 milligrams of Haldol, 45 milligrams of Rumour, which was another antidepressant, and 450 milligrams of Effexor. And she was due to start PHP the next day. So the next day, the first day of her PHP, Andrea showed up in the morning without having taken her meds, and she was reportedly documented as, quote, improved. But by the next day, she was again closed off, only answered questions in like 1 or 2 words, wasn't very, open. Once again, her roller coaster repeated itself. Some days she was more open and alert, upbeat, seemed to be progressing. Then other days she would be closed off, really regressed and quiet and just very, very depressed. On May 21st, she was observed as just sort of sitting in one spot and staring out the window all day. She was emotionless, and it is said her lips were very dry and cracked because she wasn't eating or drinking. Although Dr. Saeed noted that she was eating and sleeping well, even tolerating her meds well. He actually discussed her possible discharge for the next day. Now, her actual discharge was scheduled for May 25th. But Dr. Saeed was ready to discharge her on the 22nd, despite her being observed as just being emotionless and like staring off into space all day. Like, it's wild. On that next day, the 22nd, her posture was, quote, constricted, her affect flat, yet in her files, she was reported as, quote, much improved compared to last week. Now remember, that was one of the criticisms that Devereaux received when we discussed in part 1, that the medical staff didn't really talk to each other, didn't communicate, that different people would do like the assessments, but then these assessments and reports were signed off by different professionals who hadn't done anything, and yeah, it was just a whole mess. And this kind of seems to be evidence of that, right? And that same day, May 22nd, Andrea was officially discharged from PHP. Now, according to Rusty, Andrea attended every single day of her PHP, so I don't know if he is saying she wasn't discharged May 22nd, it was the 25th. Because, yeah, one thing in researching this case, because this was such a big case, all right, and because it hit the news, like, immediately, Like, I mean, media was already at the house when they were, taking Andrea to the police station and whatnot, There's just so many conflicting facts, and, like, it's really hard to sift through, like, okay, what was misreported and what was actually true. But we do know by the end of May, Andrea was discharged from PHP. That we do know, whether it's the 22nd or the 25th. Not sure. Now, Rusty said he wanted Andrea to be on PHP for 2 weeks, but Devereaux had just wanted her to be on it for 6 days. And I don't know if that's like the treatment center or Dr. Saeed that he's talking about. And then 2 weeks before the events of today's case, Dr. Saeed took Andrea off the Haldol, her antipsychotic, altogether. Though the Yates had been advised not to leave Andrea unattended with the children, she was not to be left alone with them. Around this time, late May, that she's discharged, that Rusty decides to leave Andrea with the kids. Yeah, alone. Unsupervised. Yeah, so check it out. Rusty would leave Andrea alone with the kids for an hour, and this was when he left for work, all right? And an hour after he had left, that is when Dora, his mother, remember she had come from Tennessee to kind of help out a little bit, would come to the house and be with Andrea. And then, for an hour in the evening time, Andrea was also left alone with the kids. I'm guessing Dora left like an hour before Rusty was to get home, and maybe that was the hour unattended that Andrea had in the evening. But yeah, despite being told by Dr. Saeed that Andrea was to have no alone time with the children, she needed help and she shouldn't be unsupervised, Rusty left her alone at least 2 hours a day with them. Now, apparently Rusty did this to improve Andrea's independence, okay? Now, Rusty had reportedly announced at a family gathering, like the weekend before of the events of today's case, that he had decided that, yeah, he was going to leave Andrea alone with the kids. And he told family at this gathering, family that included Andrea's family, her mother and siblings, that that's what he had been doing and that it was fine. He said he did this so that she would not become totally dependent on him or his mother for her maternal responsibilities. Are you frustrated yet? This guy, I swear. I have so many conflicting feelings about Rusty that we will get into. But I mean, what do you do with that? Now, it is said Andrea's family, including her mother Karen, were like shocked and horrified at this proclamation, especially because Karen pointed out to her son-in-law that Andrea wasn't stable enough to care for them completely on her own, and she had demonstrated this when they were at a family gathering, and I guess Andrea, had baby Mary, who remember is handful of months old, and apparently she was trying to feed the baby solid food and nearly choked her, and I guess Karen pointed this out to him, was yeah, dude, she can't be caring for them on her own. What are you doing? Now Dora, Rusty's mother, she believed there was nothing wrong, and later would say that she thought Andrea was perfectly capable of feeding her boys cereal before she could get there. She thought this was no problem at all. She said the thing that she worried about was if maybe Andrea would neglect something. Remember, she had filled up that bathtub with water. Dora thought, oh, maybe she had filled it up and forgotten. And it's yo, Dora, if you are afraid that she might neglect something, and neglect something important, leave a stove on or something, maybe she shouldn't be alone. It's just amazing. Not only has it been told by medical professionals, yo, she can't be alone with her kids. She's just not able to care for them right now on her own. He decides to do his own thing. And the reason behind it, right? So she wouldn't depend on him or his mother for her maternal responsibilities. Get the F out, dude. Get the F out of here. What about your responsibilities, Rusty? What, do you not have no paternal responsibilities? Now, approximately a week before today's case, Rusty took I think 2 or 3 older boys to a neighbor's house, all right? This neighbor was Patricia Salas, and her son Rocky was having a birthday party, so Rusty had, gone over there. Andrea did not attend. I don't think she was doing too hot. She was, having one of her off days. And apparently at the party, Rusty was telling anyone who would listen how Andrea had stopped taking her medication, and that they wanted to try for yet another child. Now, everyone at the party who heard this thought this was just a strange, bizarre thing for Rusty to be proclaiming, considering that she was suffering, as far as they knew, postpartum depression, I'm not sure if they were aware of the extent of Andrea's mental health struggles, but they were aware she was struggling. Rusty had told them that, and they just thought this was such a dumb, weird thing for him to be saying, when it's dude, your wife isn't even here at this party because she's still trying to get over her depression. What do you mean you guys want another child and you want her to get off the medications? Now, the weekend before the events of today's case, Andrea's friend, Deborah Holmes, visited the couple, and she was pretty horrified at her friend's condition. Quote, I couldn't believe how much weight she had lost. She looked like a cancer patient. But she said Rusty wasn't too concerned. He told Deborah it was fine, that Andrea had a doctor's appointment on the 18th, so it would be fine. We're in June at this point, by the way. And it would be fine. She'd be fine until the 18th. And Deborah straight up told him, quote, Rusty, she's not going to make it through the weekend. Deborah had apparently been a nurse with Andrea at the MD Anderson Center. And I'm not sure if she worked in the same department as Andrea or the psychiatric department or what, but she, clearly knew the signs of someone being unhealthy. And Andrea was just not looking good. But Rusty did not heed Deborah's warnings and instead waited until the 18th when Andrea had an appointment with Dr. Saeed. And it was at this appointment that Rusty told him that Andrea wasn't doing too well. Now, Rusty claims that Dr. Saeed wrote in his notes as they were talking that Andrea was doing well. And Rusty said that he, disputed this. And I'm not sure how he saw the doctor's notes, if maybe he leaned the pad forward or if there was a mirror or something. I'm not sure. But Rusty saw, the notes that Dr. Saeed was taking and was able to see that he had written that Andrea's condition was good. And he's like, bro, I just told you she wasn't doing well. He disputed Dr. Saeed's notes about that and demanded that her antidepressant be changed. Instead, Dr. Saeed agreed to lower her dosage of the Effexor, and he was going to lower it from 450 milligrams to 300. Now, Rusty disputed this because he said, according to the research he had done, that Effexor shouldn't be reduced more than 75 milligrams every 3 to 4 days, not 150 milligrams at one shot in one day. But according to Rusty, Dr. Saeed told him, quote, it's fine. Rusty also said that when he saw Dr. Saeed's notes. He also noticed that the notes, they covered like 60% of the page, right? He had taken like a good chunk of notes. And much later, when trial's going on and everything, much later, Rusty said when they showed those notes, they took up like way less space than that. And he wasn't even sure if they were the same notes. Remember, we've already talked about Devereaux's questionable record keeping. And then on June 19th, the day before the events of today's case, Dora said that she witnessed her daughter-in-law was acting strange. She was pacing in circles, scratching at her head, staring at walls, and stood and stared at the boys' cartoons they were watching. Remember, Andrea's still being left with the boys at least 2 hours every day at this point. So let's get to the day, June 20th, 2001. So Rusty leaves for work, and as per usual, Andrea is left alone with the children for a full hour before Dora would get there. But of course, as we very well know, in that 1 hour, the worst would happen. So Andrea purposely waited for Rusty to leave because she knew that he would prevent her from doing what she was about to do. So Andrea repeated her earlier attempt and filled the bathtub up with water. Then she locked up the family dog, which was a Rottweiler named Blackie. She locked him up. He usually was allowed to, run around free in the house and the yard, but she locked him up. And this time followed through on her initial plan. So Andrea started with her second oldest child, John, first, then went on to drown her third son, Paul, before drowning the youngest son, Luke. Now, after she had drowned her 3 sons, she took all their bodies, which were still wet from the bathtub, laid them on her bed slash mattress, and covered them with a sheet. She then grabbed baby Mary and drowned her as well. And while she left Mary floating in the tub, I'm not sure if she had turned around to do something or what, but she had left baby Mary floating face down in the tub. And that's when the oldest Noah had come in. He looked over and asked his mother what was wrong with Mary. And that's when Andrea told him to get in the tub, but instead Noah took off running. And Andrea chased him. Yeah, chased him down. Not sure how long, but she caught up to him probably easily. He was only like 7. And then she proceeded to drown her oldest child as well. She left Noah's body face down in the tub and then grabbed baby Mary and put her in John's arms. And then wrapped the children up in the sheet, leaving Noah in the tub. Andrea then called the police at 9:48 a.m., saying that she needed an officer immediately, but she would refuse to say why. When the 911 operator, Doreen Stubblefield, asked Andrea what the problem was, she would just say that they needed to come. The police needed to come. Doreen told her, okay, well, I need a reason for them to come. I need to know what I'm sending them into. What do you need? But still, Andrea refused to say. Doreen asked Andrea if her husband was there, because she was thinking oh, maybe this is a domestic situation. Does someone have her hostage or threatening her? Maybe it's her husband. So that's why she had asked that. Andrea said no. Doreen heard Andrea breathing irregularly and still thinking it might be a domestic violence situation. Doreen asked, quote, "Is he standing next to you?" Andrea fumbled the phone, and that's when Doreen asked if there was some kind of disturbance. She then asked Andrea, quote, "Are you ill?" Andrea said, quote, "Yes, I'm ill." Doreen asked about, her medical problems, and there was silence. Doreen then asked if she needed an ambulance, and Andrea said, quote, "No, I need a police officer." Then there was static, and the call ended. Andrea then called Rusty, who had been at work less than an hour at this point, at 9:56 a.m. And she called her husband and told him that he needed to come home right away. When he asked what was going on, she just repeated herself that he needed to get home right away. Rusty then immediately left for work and phoned his mom on his way out. Dora hadn't yet left for her son's house. Rusty then called Andrea back and asked her, what was wrong? What was going on, But Andrea only said, quote, "I need you to come home." Rusty asked her, is someone hurt? And Andrea said yes. And when he asked, who's hurt? She said, quote, "The children. All of them." Now, police ended up arriving to the home before Rusty, and when they arrived, Andrea answered the door. She was breathing heavily, visibly looked, quote, "disturbed." She was wet, and she told officers that she had killed her children. They asked where they were, and Andrea led them through the home, which officers noticed was pretty cluttered. I was a little confused because there were some conflicting reports. There were some reports that said that it was pretty disheveled and dirty, while others said that it was just kind of cluttered and untidy. Police found the Yates dog locked up where where Andrea said that she had him. And when officers entered the master bedroom, they looked down on a mattress on the floor. Other reports described it as like her and Rusty's bed. So I was confused if they slept on the floor, if that was just a little misreporting, not sure. But they looked down, at least on a mattress, and saw the sheet that had the 4 children. When they uncovered the sheet, they found John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. Their clothes wet, their bodies still warm, all their eyes open. It is said that this discovery really had an impact on the officers who found the bodies. Like they had to have some help afterwards. And then officers discovered Noah, who was lying face down in the bathtub. Now, the autopsies would of course reveal that the children died of drowning, but the autopsy also revealed that each child suffered multiple bruises to the front of the hip. This is from being held face down and repeatedly hitting a hard, flat surface, which was the bottom of the tub. This is what created those bruises. There was additional bruising on the outsides of their arms and legs, and this indicated that they had been held down by their hips, backs, and the backs of their legs as the rest of their limbs, flailed for survival. It is said each flailing child would have had to been held underwater for about 1 to 2 minutes before they lost consciousness, and then each child would have had to have been held under for an additional 4 to 8 minutes for them to succumb to drowning. It is said Mary may have taken the longest to drown because apparently babies don't need as much oxygen. Noah had the most prominent bruises on his hip bones, particularly his right hip bone. There were also dozens of bruises all around his legs, including behind his knees and up towards his thighs. Medical examiners theorized that the contusions found on Noah's legs might have been from him being pressed down at the back of his right leg and his left thigh. He had more contusions on the back of his arm and shoulder, as if he had struck the tub, and there were bruises on the inside of his right arm, as if he had been grabbed really hard. And remember, Andrea had to chase him down, so yeah, I'm sure he didn't go down easily. There was also a 2-inch by 3/4 inch bruise on Noah's forehead, and a small scrape on the left side of the bridge of his nose. John also had a pretty gnarly bruise on his forehead as well. John's hands also had a, quote, washerwoman effect, possibly from being in the water longer, or from having the wet sheet be on him and wrapped up in it. Paul had a small wound within a contusion on the inside of his lower right lip, and it looked as if his mouth had struck the tub, knocking his lip into his teeth. His left hand was wrinkled from the water, but not his right. So yeah, those poor babies just had an awful, awful death. It's just so sad. Say it all the time, all murder and all true crime is senseless, but this is just especially heartbreaking. They were children, It is said Andrea sat on her love seat as paramedics and officers, went through the house, went back and forth, secured the crime scene and all that. Her hands were just neatly folded in her lap, and she was just, sitting quietly in her love seat as all of this was going down. Rusty had arrived on scene then, and officers blocked him from entering his home. He shouted at one officer, quote, "What did she do to my kids? What did she do to my kids?" He ran to the back door, and this was as Houston police officer Frank Stumpo was trying to interview Andrea inside the home. The back door was also blocked off by officers, and they, of course, prevented Rusty from busting in, and he shouted at Andrea through the officers and the open back door, quote, "How could you do this? I don't understand." And he just dropped to his knees and just kept kind of screaming and repeating himself. Officer Stumpo closed off the back door and continued trying to interview Andrea. He asked her if she knew what she did. Yes, she did. And she was then arrested and led to a police cruiser. And Officer Stumpo drove her down to the station. Now, like I said, already at this point, the story was hitting the airwaves, all right? And it would just gain more traction as the days went on. And already, over the radio station, because again, the story had just broken over the airwaves, the words, quote, "bitch," and phrases like, quote, "just shoot her," were already filling the airwaves. People were very angry at this, very angry. And so there was a lot of emotionally reactive initial response to this case. And we'll get a little bit more into it in just a moment. The HPD spokesman, John Cannon, had actually already stated to the press, quote, "You can rest assured it will be carried as a capital case." Meanwhile, back at the home, Rusty was instructed inside his own house after Andrea had been taken away. Officers questioned him for about 10 minutes. It was about his children's clothing. They probably needed like official, ID of the bodies, I'm sure. He was then sent back outside to wait as they continued, going through the house. At that point, Dora had arrived and she waited with her son. And there was also a psychologist and a security officer that had been dispatched from NASA as well, who waited with Rusty. It is said when Rusty was informed of his children's deaths, he crumpled on the ground, he shouted, he pounded the ground with his hand, and he tossed a piece of lawn furniture across the yard. Inside, the Yates answering machine went off, and a female voice screamed, quote, "Andrea, call me, call me. It can't be you." Now, like I said, the story was breaking, and it was breaking fast. It was like a snowball rolling downhill. It just kept gaining traction as the hours and days went by. 5 hours after he had arrived at his home, Rusty was allowed back inside, and he was interviewed some more. Rusty informed the officers of Andrea's, mental health history, that she had recently been taken off her antipsychotic medication, and he had informed officers that only 2 days earlier, on the 18th, he had taken his wife to a psychiatrist, Dr. Saeed, and told him that he was, quote, concerned about her. And over at the station, under audio recording, Andrea confessed to what she did. When asked why she had killed her children, she said, quote, "Because I'm a bad mother." And by midnight, Andrea was charged with capital murder, specifically for the murders of Noah and John. And then in the wee early morning hours of June 21st, the next day, Andrea was brought before a magistrate for a, quote, probable cause for further detention hearing and commitment. And she was held without bail. Now, the Harris County District Attorney's intake report on Andrea was just rife with errors. First of all, listed Andrea as a male, added 15 pounds to her weight, and listed her as not mentally ill. Investigators were also leaking information to the press in the hours and days after the murders, including the tidbit that Andrea had admitted to investigators that she had planned to kill her children for months. They also informed the press that she was on suicide watch at the Harris County Jail, and they informed the press that Andrea supposedly had head lice when she was booked and had open sores on her scalp. And like I said, because the case was gaining traction, and of course, you know how it is with journalism, right? Gotta get the first story out there, let's not bother to verify facts or whatever. There were a lot of incorrect facts reported, such as for a hot second there, people were reporting that Andrea was actually pregnant with her and Rusty's 6th child, which was not true. Officer Stumpo had talked to the press and recounted that when Rusty was outside the house, and he was trying to interview Andrea, he had gone outside to try to calm Rusty down and asked him for, a glass of water and hey man, do you want me to go inside and get you some water to help you calm down? He said Rusty replied that would be nice, but they probably couldn't find a clean glass in the house. And I guess as Officer Stumpo was inside looking for a clean glass, I guess Andrea pointed him to this china cabinet that had a whole bunch of clean glasses there. So that's where I was a little confused on the conflicting reports on the state of the Yates household, if it was just sort of cluttered and a little unkempt, or if it was a disaster area, because there were some conflicting reports about that. Investigators eventually wrapped up their search of the Yates home, but 2 days later, they came back and searched it again, and this time they confiscated the wooden paddle, and it is said Rusty was very upset at this. Rusty ended up hiring a local attorney who played the local Santa Claus around town to represent Andrea. His name was George Parnham, and Rusty hired him on June 22nd, so just a day after she had been booked into jail. You know what I mean? He got right up on it. Parnham would later be joined by Wendell Odom. Now, Andrea's state-appointed public defender, Bob Scott, was no longer on her case. I'm guessing he appeared as her public defender when she was before the magistrate. That's the only thing I can think of, because Parnham was hired fairly quickly. But Bob Scott, before he was dismissed as her defender, had managed to get a gag order enacted. Now, Parnham and Odom tried to get this gag order reversed, but Judge Belinda Hill had refused, citing both the prosecution and the defense's willingness to do interviews, because it would take some time for this gag order to officially go through and whatnot. So it took a while, and in that time, both the defense and the prosecution and Rusty had spoken spoken with the media. Now, when the gag order was finally enacted, that was great, right? So now the police and stuff couldn't leak information to the press, but that also meant that Andrea's lawyers and Rusty could not combat the stuff that the police and law enforcement had already leaked to the press. Andrea would end up being prosecuted by district attorneys Joe Ownby and Kaylin Williford. And at this point, the prosecution still had not decided if they were going to charge Andrea with the death penalty. Parnham arranged for Rusty and Andrea's family to visit her while she was behind bars. And when she did see Rusty, it said that she stared straight ahead, didn't say anything, and as Rusty tried to talk to her, introduce her to Parnham and encourage her and stuff, it said that Andrea just leaned forward, looked at him, and said, quote, "You will be greatly rewarded." And when she was introduced to Parnham, she reportedly just said, quote, "I don't need an attorney. I'm not going to plead not guilty." And she ultimately ended this visit with Rusty by telling him, quote, "Have a nice life." Meanwhile, as media swarmed the Yates home, the church where it was rumored the children's funerals were going to be held, and any other person or place Andrea had ever known, Terry Arnold, remember she was the bookstore owner, fielded call after call of anonymous individuals who claimed to be friends and acquaintances of Andrea, and they were calling Terry to thank her. So you see, remember I said, this story really made the round super quick. So of course they were trying to get, tidbits and stuff. People's thoughts on the case, her neighbors, people who knew her. And apparently at this time, Terry was the only one who had come out and said anything positive about Andrea, saying what a caring, devoted, dedicated mother she was, how surprising this all was. And these friends and supporters of Andrea called up Terry to thank her for saying that and speaking up, because they said when they were called and contacted by the press, they were so upset in the moment they couldn't comment. They couldn't stand up for their friend. They just couldn't really fathom what was going on, you know what I mean? And they were really appreciative of Terry at least countering some of the very nasty things being said about Andrea. Like I said, there were legitimately people who were saying, why should this bitch even get a trial? Now, as the case gained local, then statewide, then national attention, there were many, many therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, many in the mental health world who came out and spoke about Andrea's case. They voiced their concern that the discussion surrounding this case shouldn't just be about postpartum depression or even psychosis. We should be talking about the whole picture, not just the mental illness itself. They criticized the whole system in general, the family system, the church system, the marriage system, the justice system, all of it. And they were talking about how it all works together to really undermine and underscore mental health, particularly when it comes to women's mental health, One psychologist named Dr. Vincent Russelli spoke about postpartum depression, talked about the symptoms, how it was diagnosed, and just kind of talked about the difficulty of navigating all of that while also dealing with children, just talking about how many women suffer from this, Andrew's case really opened this topic of discussion up on the mainstream platform, and Dr. Russelli was talking about this. And he was, likening it to his own experience. He had a 3-year-old grandson at the time, all right? And he was talking about this, and he said, quote, "It doesn't matter how tired you are. You've got to keep up. And I marvel at mothers who can take care of more than one child. And here's a woman who was overwhelmingly depressed. And to think of her trying to manage 5 children and homeschool the children, I just can't believe she could do it, even if she weren't depressed. That may be that she was discounting her ability as a parent because she wasn't even able to toilet train her children. Remember, we talked about how John still wore diapers at 5 years old. How couldn't she question her ability, being that depressed? Just trying to keep up? I'm sure she felt awful as a parent because it sounds like she had very high standards for herself." And later, it would come out, all in all, in the 90 months that Andrea and Rusty were married, she was pregnant for 40 of those months. Dr. Russelli continued on with his thoughts and observations on Rusty, saying that he didn't think the guy was a sociopath or anything, but, quote, "I think he's a denier. I read somewhere that he'd get his kids to play little games to try to cheer her up." Well, you're not going to cheer somebody up who's overwhelmed with depression. Where would she rest? Where would she have any time for relaxation? Time for herself to go exercise or take a walk with friends or have lunch with friends? She was just totally isolated. She was going to conform to what his wishes were, and that's to keep those kids out of harm's way. She had to subordinate her own needs for those of her husband's. Please everybody else and forget about yourself. In fact, it is said in the initial days after the murders, prosecutors did contemplate charging Rusty with some sort of negligence or child endangerment related to the deaths of his children. But ultimately, no charges were ever filed against Rusty or anything like that. But there were certainly a lot of criticisms directed towards him. Dr. Rosselli was also critical of Devereux, saying that its national reputation was unearned, and he said that he had actually had patients go through there, and clearly these patients did not get the proper treatment that they needed. He criticized Devereux, saying that they gave patients, quote, superficial evaluations, slapped meds onto them, and then sent them on their merry way. Dr. Rosselli also criticized modern health insurance, saying that, back in the day, there was a multitude of forms, questionnaires, interviews, and all kinds of things done to really evaluate the patient and determine what treatment they needed, what their needs were. But with privatized health insurance, they don't want to pay for that. They're like every other US company and don't want to pay for anything. So of course they always cut corners. So like I said, yeah, it really opened up the discussion of not just postpartum depression and women's mental health, but there were also, many kind of taking a sort of macro view of it and criticizing everything, right? Including our piece of crap for-profit health insurance. Because of course people's health are something you should make a profit on, right? The psychiatric nurse friend of Andrea's, remember the one that had the frustrating conversation with Rusty, said, quote, "The Andrea I knew was not capable of this, or never showed signs of it. And I've had days like that, when you just want to scream and nobody hears you, and your husband goes off to work. You stay at home, and then he comes home, and you should be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, ready for another 8 hours with him." There were certainly quite a lot of women who really sympathized and could relate to Andrea because, yeah, they had gone through bouts of that stuff as well, right? Only they didn't, suffer psychosis. The friend continued with speculation, and again, this was in the immediate, day or two after the murders, that perhaps Andrea, in some way, subconsciously, in her psychosis, had killed the children as some way to, get back at Rusty. Quote, "Was this a way for her to stand up for herself after all this time? Because subconsciously, maybe she felt like she never had a say-so in it. Or she just went along with his plans for the future. We'd better look at the whole picture. Not just a woman who has a hormonal imbalance. Did she have a support system? It's very important to have a support system. The medications can do this. Psychiatrists can do that. But when they leave your facility and they go into the real world, they don't have their doctor there to see them. They have to have a support system. A caring husband, a caring brother, or sister, or parents that can help them graduate to the normal lifestyle they had, before this happened. I do feel like women are still, taken lightly. And we're made different from men. And I don't think men see that yet. Yeah, like I said, Andrea's story and what she was going through definitely resonated with a lot of women and mothers throughout the country. Like I said, there was talk about perhaps spousal revenge being an explanation as to why Andrea did this. Again, this was in the immediate days following the murder. Ultimately, spousal revenge would be ruled out completely as a reason as to why Andrea did what she did. Now, the psychiatric nurse who worked at Devereux and was critical of Dr. Said, remember we talked a little bit about her in part 1, she stated about the case, quote, "Everybody who had anything to do with Andrea said the same thing. They felt such tremendous pity for her because she had this domineering husband that took over everything. And here was this sweet, almost childlike person. And I know that in their minds, that would have been the further thing from anybody's minds, that she could have done that to her children." She said that though Andrea hadn't verbally expressed right out what she needed, she was showing them in other ways. With her eating disorder, her self-mutilation, her behavior, there was some real obvious signs and symptoms there that something was real off board that nobody was looking at. She continued on, quote, "I do believe Rusty had a part to play in this, but not near the part Dr. Said did. I think that man," referring to Rusty, "was so frustrated with the lack of response he was getting from his treatment team that he didn't feel it was necessary." She criticized Rusty a little bit more, saying that it was wholly inappropriate for him to bring the children there to visit Andrea as she was in the psychiatric hospital not doing well, and saying that he should have hired a babysitter and come see his wife on his own. Quote, "See, I'm hearing two different stories, from the therapeutic group and then from what Russell is saying. And then with Dr. Said in the middle, I can see it both ways. I can see Rusty also getting frustrated and say, to hell with this. But I can hear from the therapeutic side that, his push was to get her home because he needed a babysitter and that was her job. So yeah, I thought that psychiatric nurse certainly had some interesting insights and a really good summation of perhaps the blame that was to go around, Now, the children's funerals were ultimately held at the Clear Lake Church of Christ on June 26th. Rusty would actually end up attending this church pretty regularly, along with his mother while she was in town. Rusty had met the minister, Byron Fike, and remember, Rusty didn't really like churches, right? Didn't really like organized religion. That's why Michael Warnicki, I think that's how you say his name, really struck a chord with him, right? But Byron earned Rusty's trust, and Rusty really liked him. And that's why Rusty decided to have the children's funerals there. Now, there were no cameras, recording equipment, or those who did not know the children allowed at the funeral. They were confused because it didn't stop the whole thing from being recorded anyway. There was even members of the press who had been invited to the funeral, so I'm not too sure what that was about. Rusty delivered the eulogies for all of his children himself, apparently when his own father had died. I think it was a minister who had delivered his father's eulogy, just really butchered a lot of stuff and clearly didn't know his dad, and he did not want the same for his children, so he insisted on delivering all the eulogies. And after the funerals and after the cameras had been swept away from the Yates home, it is said that that night at his home, Rusty just dribbled the basketball and shot hoops in his front yard. They had a basketball hoop and just shot hoops all night in his front yard, and a bunch of neighbors, peeked out their window and looked at him. Now, there had been a fund established to help Rusty pay for the children's funerals. However, all right, I don't think this was disclosed publicly, or at the very least wasn't disclosed openly. Get this. Any excess funds that were left over from that just went directly to Rusty, which is highly unusual because usually stuff like that, right? If it's something like for a funeral or something for an event, after the event, if there's any leftover funds, normally that gets donated to charity. But not in this instance. And this is just one of the questionable, bizarre, weird, head-scratching behaviors that Rusty exhibited. So meanwhile, at the jail, Andrea was, visiting with her family, and she just said, quote, "I think the devil's in me." "How long do you think the devil's been in me?" Andrea's sister, Michelle, said, quote, "She was crying for help, but she couldn't speak. We miss our sister very much." Patrick, one of Andrea's brothers, said, quote, "There was just a blackness in her eyes. I don't know if she was there or in her heart, but from what I saw in her eyes, and from the response I got from her, is that she is just not there." He said the woman who had attempted suicide after her 4th pregnancy, quote, "was back again. The darkness, no response." Karen said of her daughter, quote, "She's getting better." This was as the days were going by. "She's facing up to things." She said Andrea had asked if each of her children had gotten their own casket, and they had. And then she had cried out, quote, "Why did I do this? Why did I do this?" It was reported that Andrea had specifically requested no articles or news coverage, footage, or anything shown to her of her children's funerals. She just couldn't really deal with it at that moment. Andrea's family firmly stuck by her side, and they did their best to counteract the vitriolic, emotionally responsive stuff being said about Andrea in the press. In August, Karen gave an interview to NBC detailing how the family still supported her and how Andrea had been doing in her mental recovery. Now, I do not believe Karen or any of Andrea's siblings were under the gag order. I think it was specifically for the defense, the prosecution, Rusty, and his mother. Maybe it's because they had interacted with Andrea, right before the murders. Not sure why Dora was under the gag order, but yeah, reportedly she was. And as the days, weeks, and months passed and Andrea was sitting behind bars, she would speak with lots and lots of, psychiatrists, psychologists, and whatnot, and we'll go through just some. This is not the extensive list of everyone she met with. These are just some little tidbits that I thought were interesting and kind of gets us a little bit into Andrea's mind a little bit, and just kind of speaks to her progress behind bars. So one of the doctors that Andrea met, one of the first ones, was Dr. Melissa R. Ferguson. She had spoken with Andrea the day after she'd been brought to jail. Andrea told her that she thought her children's cartoons were speaking to her. They were criticizing her, calling her a bad mother, telling her that she fed her children too much candy and too much cereal. She also believed that there was a camera in her jail cell's light fixture that was monitoring her, and she asked Dr. Ferguson how long she had been under surveillance. She also believed that media had planted cameras inside of her home years ago in order to monitor her as a mother. Dr. Ferguson believed Andrea was suffering from major depressive disorder and was psychotic. Quote, in all the patients I've treated for major depression with psychotic features, she is one of the sickest I have ever seen. And at this point, Dr. Ferguson had interviewed and diagnosed like over 6,000 patients. Dr. Ferguson also said that Andrea had told her that prior to conceiving baby Mary, quote, she had told Rusty that she did not want to have sex because Dr. Starbranch has said she might hurt her children. Andrea told Dr. Ferguson that Rusty had countered with his religious BS about reproduction. He complimented Andrea on what a good mother she was, trying to convince her that like, oh, see, you're a good mother, and managed to persuade her that she could handle more children. Yeah, can you believe that, guys? This is after everything. This is before Mary is conceived, but after she has had her suicide attempts after Luke's birth. And yeah, can you believe this? I mean, honestly, it's no wonder that Rusty was criticized after this. Dr. Ferguson also noted that in their interviews, Andrea picked at her lip, like compulsively, seemed to become upset at times. But for the most part, she remained unemotional. She said Andrea could not give her children's birthday information, even though she had told a police deputy that the day before. But Dr. Ferguson thought maybe Andrea could be confused because she had just changed medications. They had put her on different medications in the jail, like that very morning. So she thought maybe this could be why Andrea was still a little confused. Dr. Ferguson said, quote, no, I do not believe she was faking her symptoms, and she would testify to this later. Another doctor who spoke with Andrea while she was behind bars, it was 2 weeks after the murders, was Dr. Deborah Osterman, and she noted some progress in Andrea when she talked to her. Andrea reported to her that she was no longer seeing satanic ducks or teddy bears on her jail cell wall, and she was hearing fewer noises from hell. I guess that would be an improvement, yeah. Andrea reported that she did not remember speaking about a prophecy. This was the day after the murders, after she'd been brought in. And this prophecy she had spoken of, she thought Satan was inside of her, and the only way to save her children from eternal damnation was to kill them. She did not remember speaking about this. Dr. Osterman said that the remission of the hallucinations meant that the medication Andrea was on was having an effect. Quote, she finally looked as if she had a little bit of life behind her eyes. While a very tiny step, it was a major improvement to how she had been. She said that the fact Andrea couldn't recall this prophecy also meant that her mental state was improving just slowly. Dr. Lucy Puryear was a psychiatrist, specifically an expert on reproductive related psychiatric illness and disorders, spoke with Andrea about 5 weeks after the murders. And in this taped interview, Andrea cried and explained a little bit about why she had done what she had done. Quote, in their innocence, I thought they would go to heaven. Since they were so young. And she trailed off and just kind of broke down, crying and in tears. It was a pretty emotional interview. And I'm not sure exactly which doctor Andrea said this to or when, but at some point she told one doctor that she had actually been contemplating the murders of her children for 2 years. She said that she was not a good mother and she thought her sons were developing improperly. Quote, it was the 7th deadly sin. My children weren't righteous. They stumbled because I was evil. The way I was raising them, they could never be saved. They were doomed to perish in the fires of hell. She thought that Satan had influenced her children and made them disobedient. And yeah, she thought if she killed them while they were still innocent, they would have a better chance of going to heaven. Now, in the immediate days following Andrea's arrest and the story breaking, Parnham, remember her lawyer, we're making the press rounds, right? Remember, this was before the gag order had been enacted. And of course, he was doing his job, defending his client, citing her history of mental illness, citing that she was heavily medicated, so medicated that she still couldn't even have really a rational conversation. Quote, she's flatlined for want of a better phrase. Basically, what my visitations consist of are unilateral conversations and observation. He was laying the groundwork for what his defense at trial and in court would be. That Andrea was suffering a deep psychosis, had a history of debilitating mental illness, and and did not know right from wrong, making her legally insane under Texas law. This, according to Parham in her defense, was the only explanation for why Andrea did what she did. Rusty ended up giving a front yard press conference, like, it was either like the day of or the day after the murders. Like, it was super, super quick after the murders and everything. And he gave this conference, in his front yard, in his home, which was technically a crime scene. And this was just one of the many behaviors that would have people raising an eyebrow. And again, remember, this was before the gag order was officially enacted, because we're talking like, the day after, the day of. It was very quick. So at this press conference, he spoke how he had come to discover that his children were dead, reiterated what happened that morning. It said he was extremely emotional and shaking. Remember, we talked about in the part 1, Rusty, when he's nervous or emotional or stressed, he shakes a lot. And because of this, he just came off as like off to some people, while others were, hey, it's just his grief, and people grieve differently. So at this press conference, he said he still supported Andrea. Quote, "It's hard, because on one hand, I know she killed our children, but on the other, I know that the woman here," he was holding a picture of the family and he pointed at Andrea, "is not the woman who killed my children." And when reporters asked Rusty about Andrea's history of depression, specifically her postpartum depression, and did he know how serious it was, Rusty responded, quote, "No. She went through postpartum depression with our 4th child, and it was very serious then. She had attempted suicide then, and they, gave her medication, and it took a while, but she just snapped out of it. She was just like herself again, all of a sudden, And that was a couple of years ago, This is, I think, what really frustrates people with Rusty specifically is, he just, had downplayed Andrea's sickness. And he's still, by the way, pet peeve, he's still referring to it as postpartum depression when clearly she had psychosis, postpartum psychosis. And it's really frustrating that he just kind of downplays it. She's had postpartum depression, and, she tried to commit suicide after Luke, but, everything was fine then. Then she just snapped out of it. No, she didn't. He continued on, quote, "And she was fine from that time up until a few months after she had our 5th child. But her dad passed away about 3 months or so after we had our baby girl. And, that really just sent her spiraling down. I think she was just primed for that depression. That postpartum depression. The environment just triggered it with her dad dying. And we were all hopeful that she would respond to the same medications that she did the first time, but she never responded that well. She got to maybe 65%, and sort of plateaued there, and sort of stayed there. She plateaued. He claimed that no psychiatrist, no doctor, not Dr. Starbranch, not Dr. Said, no one had told him that his wife was psychotic. And he said that had he had known how bad it was, and had he known that she was psychotic, he would have never had more kids. Remember, we have Dr. Starbranch who even told them, having more kids would guarantee more episodes. But this is what Rusty's telling the press. However, Andrea's brother, Brian, the one it is said that she was the closest to, would say of Rusty, quote, "I'd like to say some things, but the truth will eventually come out." He later told CNN in an interview that on a trip to Devereaux to see Andrea, it was him and Rusty had expressed to him that all depressed people need is a, quote, "swift kick in the pants" to get them motivated. So like I said, Rusty's sort of, I don't want to say indifference, but him sort of undermining his wife's condition and whatnot and not taking it as serious as he should have was definitely the main thing he was criticized for, definitely, by both mental health professionals and the public in general. On June 28th, 2 of Andrea's siblings, Andrew and Michelle, made the press rounds themselves to, again, I've said this a couple of times now, counteract the image being painted of Andrea in the press. The Kennedy family was trying to mourn quietly and trying to deal with all this, amongst themselves and private behind closed doors. But of course, they were constantly bombarded for interviews, up to 20 a day. Apparently it got so bad that Karen eventually just tacked a note to her front door, just begging reporters and press to not even knock on her door, basically just saying, please go away. But of course it didn't stop them. And so her siblings decided to go and make the press rounds and try to counteract this horrible rhetoric being spoken about their sister. Michelle stated that their family did have a history of depression. Herself herself and two of her brothers were actually on antidepressants, and she really urged the need for those suffering from depression to be supported. Quote, "My sister was a very good mother. I knew something was wrong, but I tried to talk to her and ask her, is everything okay? And she'd say fine, but I could tell by looking at her that it wasn't okay. I just want everybody to know that it's time for us to start observing people with signs of depression. My coworkers noticed change in me, and they supported me. If you see signs of depression, ask and promote any kind of support you can." They also spoke about how concerned they had been with Andrea and Rusty having so many children in such a short span of time, especially after the fourth pregnancy with Luke. They said that they could tell that something wasn't right. Andrea just had this dead, faraway look in her eyes. We've already read a couple of comments alluding to that. They said Andrea was very reclusive, had lost a lot of weight, especially in the last 6 months before the murders. Hence, why they were so concerned with her having so many children in such a short amount of time. Andrea said that actually she had lost so much weight and was drinking and eating so little that she stopped producing milk for Mary. They said Andrea tried so hard to just be the perfect wife and mother, and that with each child that came along, that just added more and more pressure to her. They revealed that they often did try to communicate with their sister, via phone calls, but they would go unanswered. And even before the murders, they truly did wonder just how much support Rusty was giving Andrea. It definitely seems that, though Andrea spoke with her family and even visited them, right, she definitely kept them at arm's length. It definitely appears that both Rusty and Andrea kind of did this, right? They never really opened up about, the real stuff going on. Deborah Holmes could also see the deterioration of her friend, and she had actually started keeping a diary of Andrea's decline. She was actually the one who had called the home and left that voicemail. She said after Luke's birth, Andrea had become, quote, a total zombie. She'd stare into space for a long time, take a long time to speak or answer questions, and sometimes couldn't even finish her sentences. Deborah said she did help out with the kids in 1999 after Andrea's hospital stays, and she said that a few months after her discharge, Andrea was talking to her, and, quote, "She asked me if I thought Satan could read her mind, and if I believed in demon possession." Deborah said she pleaded with Rusty on numerous occasions that he had to take care of his wife. He had to get her help. And finally, according to Deborah, after enough badgering, Rusty had admitted Andrea to the Devereaux Treatment Center a second time. Andrea's siblings said both Andrea and Rusty had been involved with an out-of-state religious group, is how they described it, and as we know, that was the Warnickis. And they confirmed that they did give the group money. And apparently 6 months before the murders, Andrea had actually requested that Michael and Rachel send their kooky little pamphlets and religious information that they disseminated on college campuses to her family. She wanted her family to check out their gospel. And it is said when the Kennedys received this information, they were, kind of didn't know what to think, right? So, it condemned the family's religion of choice, Catholicism. Remember, Michael preached that all organized religion and churches were evil. Andrew, remember, Andrew's brother, said, quote, "To me, it was kind of a cult religion. They believed in God, but they made statements like Catholics are all going to hell. It had some stuff from the Bible, but there was something about it all that just wasn't right." And apparently their reaction to this caused some kind of conflict between Andrea and her family. Andrew also said, quote, "I would like for Andrea to get the help she needs. I think with God's help and people helping out, she'll get better. I don't think it would do society good, or my family, or Andrea any good to execute her." Now, more information about the relationship between the Yates and the Warnickis would come out. All the preaching letters and the just wild letters that Rachel had sent Andrea came out and, were released to the press. And this led many to think that, they had a hand to play in the children's murders as well. Here you have this mentally ill woman who already thinks that she's a terrible mother and that she somehow damned her kids to hell. And then you have Rachel and Michael writing her, telling her, oh, everything's evil and everyone's going to hell and whatnot. And there was a lot of people who said, hey, man, these guys, we're going to blame Rusty Yates as well. We should be blaming these guys too. Now, when the press asked the Warnickis what exactly their relationship to the Yates was, both Rusty and Michael and Rachel just tried to downplay their whole relationship, saying that oh, well, we're all actually not that close. Rusty insisted that Michael and Rachel were not responsible responsible for Andrea's delusions. Rusty maintained that him staying in touch with Michael and Rachel was just to help him and Andrea strengthen their marriage, and to find the love that Michael and his own family had found with Jesus. Both Michael and Rusty said that the connection between Michael's preaching and Andrea's religious delusions were, quote, nothing more than media-created fiction. And apparently, as the days, weeks, and months went by after the murders, I guess the distance between Rusty and the Warnickis kind of widened. And apparently it was starting to widen prior to the murders. It said that there was actually a little bit of friction between them, and I think Rusty was starting to get a little tired of Michael's like fire and brimstone type of preaching. I guess Michael and Rachel were like calling Rusty and Andrea, quote, hypocrites for their, quote, yuppie lifestyle. Remember, this could be what Rachel was alluding to in that letter to Andrea. Remember, we read it in part 1 where she was talking about, living in the bus, it goes against your yuppie lifestyle, and that's, God telling you that that's the best thing to do or whatever. And from just what I could gather, from what I could read, it really seems that like the Warnickis were really pressuring the Yates to live like them, to be isolated from everyone. Remember, because the world is evil and big and bad, and you can only trust your family. Really pressuring to live just like them with the bus and everything. And maybe this is why Rusty was such a dick when he got back from that trip to Florida. Remember, they went to Florida to look at the Greyhound bus? And then when Rusty gets back, he just treats people like dirt all of a sudden. Maybe that could explain why. Because Michael and Rachel were calling him hypocrites and stuff and saying they were doing everything wrong. Who knows? Now, people around town, like we've already alluded to, we're definitely talking about the case, right? There were people who characterized the Yates family as weird. We talked a little bit about them in part 1. Someone who worked with Rusty, actually a fellow engineer, get this, actually pondered if Rusty, hadn't done the murders by planting ideas in Andrea's head. Isn't that wild? There were other co-workers who felt that Rusty was partially responsible for the murders of his children. And then remember, we were talking a little bit about some of the questionable behavior about Rusty. Well, 2 weeks after the murders, apparently a co-worker of Rusty's sent a mass email out to all the NASA employees claiming that Rusty needed donations for new furniture. This was so he could furnish a spare bedroom in his home. Now, there were many NASA employees and co-workers who thought this was just very tasteless and tacky, and they were extremely offended that Rusty would have a friend send this type of email out. They thought it was completely inappropriate. It also didn't help that the wife of one of Rusty's co-workers saw Rusty out and about with some friends. This was about a month after the murders, and this wife was appalled that Rusty was out and about laughing it up with his friends. They just had a good old time, and she just thought it was very odd. She said they acted, quote, with no more gravity than if his wife had burned dinner. Which, I'm not sure how to feel like that, right? I try not to drudge people's grieving, right? Everyone grieves differently, and a month after the murders, I just what do you want him to do, I guess, So I don't know how fair that was, but again, it just doesn't help with, all the other bad optics going on. That certainly doesn't help, right? At this point, Rusty had also established a public open for all website. He called it yateskids.org. And here he showed photos of his kids and stuff. Now, as the case made its way through the courts, all of Andrew's medical files, and I mean all, including physician's notes, admissions forms, nurses' notes, progress notes, physician's orders, psychiatric reports, anything at all related to Andrew's mental health was ordered to be handed over to a grand jury because, they needed to look at all the evidence and see is there enough to formally charge her, right? And all of Andrew's doctors, including Dr. Saeed and Starbranch, were not only required to hand over all of their medical files regarding Andrea, they were also called to testify. And they would be called to testify for any, hearing, trial, and everything that would happen. Now, 2.5 weeks after the murders of the Yates children. Andrea's defense had still not been given the statement, like a transcript or like a tape of the recorded interview or statement that Andrea had given to police when they brought her in. They also requested transcripts of any medical testimony that was to occur. Now, an anonymous man who was intimately familiar with Houston's criminal justice system and how it worked and the major players and all that spoke to the press, again, anonymously. And this person told them that Andrea was clearly, quote, a sick puppy, was clearly not sane or in her right mind when she, murdered her children. But he warned that the head DA, Chuck Rosenthal, who had actually faced Andrea's lawyer Parnham in court in 1992 when Parnham had successfully argued a not guilty by reason of insanity, quote, plays to win. This is a big case. Chuck Rosenthal is thinking, I've got to look good. What's going to make me look good? He also said that Rosenthal was known to, quote, hide police reports and other relevant documentation from the defense and also the public, and pretty much saying, like, we need to watch this dude because he plays dirty. It should also be noted that Harris County, where this occurred, proudly boasted itself at the time, don't know if they still do, but at the time, boasted itself as the death capital of the United States. Weird flex, but okay. Cool. Now, in July, Parnham and Odom would file a motion requesting Andrea have a competency hearing because they believed that she had, quote, neither sufficient ability to consult with counsel with a reasonable degree of understanding, nor a rational or factual understanding of the proceedings against her. So basically saying that, like, we can't even really converse with her, and she can't even really, like, assist in her defense. We need a competency hearing because we don't even think that she's competent enough to stand trial. Parnham argued that even though, like, he could converse, like, words with Andrea, he could, like, say sentences to her, he found her, like, unable to actually consult with him on her defense. They also had mental health professionals that agreed with them, and in the end, Judge Hill granted the defense's request, and she ordered Andrea to be mentally evaluated, and she would actually be evaluated twice. And then, on July 24th, Judge Hill would order Andrea to undergo a third psychological examination. At Andrea's preliminary hearing that happened on July 30th, the Harris County grand jury decided that there was more than enough sufficient evidence to charge Andrea with murder, specifically for the murders of Noah, John, and Mary. And these indictments opened Andrea up for the death penalty. Now, the prosecutors decided not to prosecute Andrea for the deaths of Paul and Luke because their deaths would be brought out at trial anyway. Parnham and Odom found that the prosecution wasn't going after her for two of her children's deaths in case they lost this one and they could charge her again. That's what they were theorizing. And in response to the indictments, Parnham and Odom filed their intent to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, Texas law required that in order to assert the insanity defense, the defendant must prove that they could not discern right from wrong at the time of the crime. On August 8th, Andrea had her arraignment, and Rusty, along with his mother Dora, appeared. Now, again, we talked a little bit about Rusty's, like, questionable behavior. This is just adding to that. So I guess him and his mother's demeanor just kind of rubbed people the wrong way. I guess they purposely took routes to the courthouse and walked to the courthouse that didn't avoid the press. Like, they had been shown, like, some back ways they could take, but yeah, they decided to just, walk out in front of the press. Rusty said that he was now, quote, used to it and used to all the attention. And he said that he couldn't say anything to them anyway because of the gag order. Dora, who had a smile on her face, it was described, said that she too was under the gag order and couldn't say anything, which again was just kind of weird to some people because nobody was talking to her. And on his way into the courthouse, with bulbs and cameras going off left and right, Rusty turned around and smiled at some of the press. At least that's how was it interpreted by some. Others said that it wasn't a smile, it was a grimace. And at the arraignment, her defense inserted their plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. A report from Dr. Stephen Rubenzer, who was a psychologist and who worked for the Harris County Mental Health Authority, determined that Andrea was of a, quote, legal level of competency. Thus, she could stand trial. So that's what he testified to, or rather his report did. However, Andrea's lawyers wanted a jury to decide that, not some psychologist who worked for the county. They had two psychologists of their own who determined that Andrea Andrea was too incompetent to stand trial, so they had their own experts, and they wanted a jury to decide whose side was right. Was Andrea competent enough to stand trial? Judge Hill granted the defense's request, and her competency hearing was scheduled for September 12th. Parnham and Odom also requested all of Andrea's psychological records and all of that be turned over to them, as well as additional information from Dr. Rubinser. They also wanted the grand jury transcripts from her preliminary hearing that would be relevant to the competency hearing, such as the transcripts from when Dr. Said had testified. Judge Hill granted that request, but only the parts with Dr. Said's testimony. But get this, later that same evening, Judge Hill lifted the gag order for the prosecution, and it was so that they could take this time to announce that they were indeed going to go after Andrea with the death penalty. Now, the defense was not allowed to respond to this. They were only allowed to announce that a defense fund had been set up for Andrea. They also announced that any excess funds would be donated to organizations that focused on women's mental health. The Houston Area National Organization of Women announced that they were actually forming the Andrea Yates Support Coalition, which would help raise funds for Andrea's defense. And man, there were a lot of people who were not happy that they were siding with Andrea. There was a lot of hate towards this woman, y'all. A lot. And again, let's go over to some more bizarre behavior by Rusty. I came across this and I thought it was so bizarre and weird. And so I just wanted to share it with you. So I mentioned before, right, that the Clear Lake Church, where the children had their funerals, Rusty ended up attending there and becoming a member, right? So the church had like weekly potlucks and stuff. And on August 19th, Rusty attended one of these potlucks. So I guess everyone was waiting in line, right? And Rusty allowed a woman to cut in front of him in line. But she insisted like, no, you go first. And, they went back and forth for a minute before the woman said, quote, "No, you go first. In my family, the men are always served first." Rusty, it said, immediately beamed and lit up at this and was like, quote, "Oh, really?" And stepped in front of her, started loading up his plate. Like, this really made him happy. He was super stoked to hear this. Now, once he was sitting down eating, it said all of the church women, from the college age girls to the older ladies, just peppered Rusty with questions. They asked how his mom was. They were just giving him so much attention. And it said Rusty's demeanor was very pleasant, relaxed, laid back, grinned, laughed, and it was very clear that he was enjoying the attention he was getting. Some would go on to note that they thought Rusty was especially interested in the younger college age, childbearing age girls. One college student said she went to Texas A&M, and Rusty bragged how I just helped a friend move there not too long ago, the weekend before last or whatever. He said he had driven a U-Haul truck there, and he said he got the U-Haul going up to 70 miles per hour, even though you're not supposed to drive those U-Haul trucks faster than 45 miles per hour. And he was saying how the U-Haul trailer was whipping back and forth and just I don't know, came off as kind of cringe to me, he was some badass or something. Yeah, he said he just handled it with ease, and I don't know, it was weird. He told everyone that he was planning on writing a book, but he said it was so he could pay Andrew's defense. He said he had already paid her lawyers $10,000. Her family had given them an additional $30,000, and he estimated that he would probably have to pay upwards of $100,000 or more. So he needed to keep his options open. And that was also why he wouldn't share photos of his children to the press. He wanted to save it for his book and for his website. Now, it said at times, Rusty's eyes looked watery, especially as he reminisced about the good times his family had, maybe he was gonna cry or get emotional. He said that, he just went on talking about how everyone who met Andrea loved her, what a great mother she was. But as he went on, and it looked like, he was gonna again, tear up or get emotional, I guess he just immediately jumped up and got in line and just wolfed down 3 desserts. And then he just shook his head and said, quote, "I just can't eat brownies. I just don't have the sweet tooth my mother has." And then people pointed out to him "Bro, you just wolfed down 3 desserts, including a brownie. What are you talking about?" And it was as if he didn't realize what he had just done. And when he was told that, he immediately jumped up and got a sandwich, saying that he had to have breads with his sweets. So again, I don't know if this guy is just pushing emotions down. I don't know if he's just weird. He talked about good times with his family and also went into great detail about Andrea's mental health. Quote, if Andrea wasn't on trial, who would be? He answered his own question and blamed the doctors, the medical community, and the health insurance company, saying that they had prevented and blocked Andrea from getting the proper care she needed and getting the full treatment she truly deserved. He said his insurance company had only approved a 10-day stay at Devereaux. He criticized Dr. Saeed, wished he would have inquired more, and he claimed that he begged them to give Andrea that antidepressant antipsychotic mix that she had gotten at Spring Shadows Glen in 1999. But he said Devereaux had told him that Haldol was an old drug, and they put her on Risperdal instead. He said in July, when Andrea was waiting behind bars, he'd gotten a call from a Harris County jail doctor who said that she was going to put Andrea back on that original antipsychotic antidepressant mix. He said, quote, she didn't know the significance of what she was saying. And he went on saying that if Devereaux had just given Andrea the Haldol from the start like he wanted, quote, my kids would be alive, Andrea would be in recovery, and we wouldn't be famous. Yeah, man, again, like... It seems like he thought the Haldol was like a magical cure-all, and I don't know, Rusty's attitude just bugged me. Like, he's not a mental health professional, and I don't know, just the way he was going on about the Haldol just really bugged me. Like, it's not some magical cure-all, dude. And not to mention, right, even if that does work, it's usually medication working with therapy and stuff that usually is involved in the treatment, right? And I don't know, it's just really bugging me. Now, Rusty would end up doing 2 prominent interviews with 60 Minutes and Time magazine. And this was part of his, like, strategic plan to save his wife as he saw it. Rusty said that he felt judged and persecuted in Clear Lake, saying that he didn't understand why people were judging him and his family just because they were, quote, traditional. Oh, really, Rusty? Oh, really? Are you upset people are judging you for your life choices? You know who else was probably upset? Those women that you were a misogynistic prick to at NASA. No. See, this is... I hate people like this. You don't get to sit there and say, well, what was me? People are judging me, when you have gone around and judged other people for not adhering to your lifestyle and to your morals. You don't get to play that game. Sorry, that just really bugged me when I saw that he said that. Just like, excuse me, what? No, I don't think so. So by the time Rusty did these interviews, the gag order was in full swing. But I guess as long as he didn't explicitly talk about the trial or anything, you know, kind of related to the court hearings or whatever that would violate the gag order, I guess he should be fine. He had sort of like skirted the line up until this point, and he felt if he could just get his and Andrea's story out there to help combat like the really hateful rhetoric going on, that he could help save his wife. Because yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people assumed that she was gonna get the death penalty. He said the DA's office had been talking, so why couldn't he? Now, on 60 Minutes, when he asked if he would forgive Andrea, he responded, quote, she doesn't need to be forgiven. He argued that she had a good heart, just a bad mind. And he even argued that when she was killing the children, she thought she was doing the right thing because she thought she was a bad mother and was saving them, you know? And yeah, Rusty thought he was playing 3-dimensional chess here, all right? And he had these interviews strategically timed and placed. So the 60 Minutes interview, he had wrangled it so that it was going to air after Andrea's competency hearing. And then the Time article couldn't be published until the 60 Minutes interview had aired first. Like, yeah, he thought he was like, I don't know, like a really smooth, I guess, PR guy or something. I thought it was amusing. Rusty said that he felt the gag order, which he said the judge didn't even fully understand herself and didn't even like really explain, violated his First Amendment rights. And at the insistence of Parnham, had even hired attorney Edward A. Mallet, who was president of the National Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys, to represent his interests. But I guess Rusty didn't really need to worry about these interviews. Apparently Chuck Rosenthal, remember that was the head DA, I guess he had violated the gag order when I guess he spoke to 60 Minutes about the whole case or whatever. Because remember, I don't think it was just the prosecutors themselves that ordered the gag order. It was like the prosecutor's office, you know, and Chuck Rosenthal was like the head DA, you know, so he kind of like spoke for the office. And honestly, it really did kind of feel like the judge didn't quite know what she wanted with the gag order, because yeah, there were several times that both Rusty and the DA's office, I felt like, talked about the case, and so you would think that would violate the gag order, but yeah, who knows. Now, during these times that Rusty does these interviews, it said that he was kind of delusional, all right? He was not really grounded in reality at this time. He seriously thought that Andrea would be found innocent and she would go and get help, and once she got help, she would come out and they would go live their lives, have more children, and be on their merry little way. He even tried to come up with a solution of them having children that didn't involve Andrea giving birth, including surrogacy, adoption. Like, he had it all worked out. And it said that Andrea's family, her attorneys, her doctors were, like, mortified at this dude's line of thinking. They're like, bro, what? No. That's all I could think about was breeding more children. Can you believe that? Now, it said Rusty eventually did come back to reality and kind of stop thinking that way. Then, on September 11th, 2001, the day jury selection was to begin for Andrea's competency hearing, something happened in the United States that sort of distracted the whole nation, and this pushed her competency hearing back until September 19th. Now, on the 19th, Judge Hill reiterated to the prospective jurors that they were there to determine if Andrea was competent to stand trial. This meant that they were not to reflect or determine her state of mind on the day of the murders, but to determine the state of her mind now. Judge Hill then explained the difference, legally speaking, between insanity and competency. Insanity meant that Andrea did not know the difference between right and wrong at the time of the murders due to mental illness, and competency meant she had the present ability to assist in her own defense. Confer with her attorneys, understand what was going on, what was being presented in court, etc., etc. That was the difference. And she reminded the jurors, like, remember, you're here to determine competency. She reminded them that the burden of proof was on Andrea's attorneys, based on a preponderance of evidence, not reasonable doubt. And she reminded the jury that if they were to find Andrea incompetent, she'd be remanded to a mental health facility until such a time she was ready to stand trial. At this hearing, Dr. Rubenzer testified, and he testified for the prosecution. And the defense, remember I said they'd gotten their own experts. They had gotten Dr. Gerald Harris, a clinical psychologist, to testify for them. Now, Dr. Harris met with Andrea on 4 different occasions, and these meetings occurred in June and August. He diagnosed her as having overt psychosis, hallucinations, and delusions when he had first met her in June. Quote, she said she had seen images of Satan in the walls, in the cinder block of her cell, and that Satan was also talking to her. He said sometimes, like when they were talking, she would even sort of like stare off to the side a little bit as if she was, noticing someone else in the room or something else in the room that distracted her attention. Which for some reason, like that really gave me the creeps. When he saw her in August, he said that she did look much better. Quote, on the surface, she did answer questions quicker, she maintained eye contact, and she did tell him that she was not experiencing any more visions. But when he asked her about Satan talking to her and conversing with her, he said that she responded with the present tense. Quote, she still had some belief about these delusional ideas. She continuously told Dr. Harris that she was not mentally ill, and in determining if she was competent, Dr. Harris then tested Andrea for 4 different types of memory. Visual recognition, where something looks familiar. Recall, where one remembers facts. Immediate auditory recall. This is for something that someone has just heard. And delayed auditory recall, for something one has heard after an extended period of time. Andrea scored in the single percentile group for everything but visual recognition. And because of these results, Dr. Harris testified that he was worried what the stress of a trial would do to Andrea's mind, worried that she may still have residual delusions, and he worried just how effective she could be in communicating with her defense counsel when her memory was so bad. Now, Dr. Rubenzer, again, he's testifying for the prosecution. He met with Andrea 7 times while she was behind bars, 3 times in July, twice in August, and twice in September. Actually, the September meetings were actually conducted without her lawyers or Judge Hill's knowledge. And as a result, these interviews were not supposed to be mentioned or talked about in his testimony, but they still were. Dr. Rubenzer said his July meetings with Andrea were pretty similar to what other doctors had testified already, that she had trouble understanding questions, took a long time to answer, and didn't seem to really be present. In their August meetings, he said Andrea was assessed specifically for intelligence and memory. Quote, she did reasonably well, and he said, though she did have a problem with her attention and concentration, she could stay on task and could remember a sequence sequence of 3 numbers on her second try. In September, he testified that she was much more improved, and he thought that she was mentally competent to stand trial. He said he met with her on September 17th because, her hearing had been postponed and it was coming up, and he wanted to make sure that his assessment that she was mentally competent to stand trial was still correct, and he found that to be true. And on September 22nd, 2001, the jury agreed, and they found her competent enough to stand trial. Her trial would begin in January of 2002, and it would end up lasting a couple of months. Testimony wouldn't even be heard until February because jury selection would take 5 weeks. So during the trial, the prosecution, of course, going for the death penalty, really focused on the emotional impact, really hammered. It went into detail on the children's murders, how, they were sweet, innocent children and whatnot. Definitely trying to tug at the jurors' heartstrings, right? The defense maintained their original position that Andrea was suffering from psychosis, required mental treatment, not jail, and certainly not death. And many doctors, nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, bunch of medical professionals were called to testify, some for the prosecution, some for the defense. And this include doctors Ferguson, Starbranch, and Said, in addition to 2 prominent forensic psychiatrists. Dr. Philip Resnick, who testified for the defense, and Dr. Park Dietz, who testified for the prosecution. Now, both these doctors, who were friends, were actually pretty notable. They had talked to and consulted on cases like the Jeffrey Dahmer case and the Ted Kaczynski case. So they were held in high regard and had dealt with high-profile cases before. Now, all of the experts testified to Andrea's mental illness, all right? That wasn't what was in question, all right? It was the severity of her mental illness and whether she was aware that her actions of murdering her children were right or wrong. That was really what they were debating. Everyone could agree that Andrea clearly had mental health issues and was mentally ill, but the argument was, to what degree, to what severity, and did this absolve her of responsibility, criminally speaking? Dr. Resnick evaluated Andrea about 3 weeks after the murders, and she told him that she had drowned her children because she thought she had ruined them so much. And so much so that she thought John was going to grow up to be a serial killer, and Luke, who I guess had been slow to talk, he was like a late talker, would end up as a mute gay sex worker. He said she knew her actions were illegal because she fully expected to be executed. And this was based on her delusion that Satan was inside of her, and he also had to be killed. So killing her means killing Satan. He said that she had tried to commit suicide in 1999 in order to, quote, protect her children. Protect them from Satan, who was within her. But by 2001, her psychotic state had warped that into, no, now you gotta save the children's souls because it's too late now. But according to Dr. Resnick, Andrea did not know killing her children was wrong because she was, in fact, trying to save them from hell, trying to save them from eternal damnation. She told him that when the children had been coloring, and I guess they were drawing pictures of fire trucks, she thought Satan was sending her a message through these pictures that her children were going to go to hell. Dr. Resnick testified that in her warped, damaged mind, Andrea thought all 5 of her children were unrighteous, they were defective, and they would grow up to be criminals. Quote, if she did not take their lives while they were still innocent, they would end up in hell. Mrs. Yates knew what she was doing was right for her children. This was defeating Satan. He said the fact that she called 911 to report the incident actually showed that she truly thought that what she had done had been the right thing to do. Nurses and workers from Devereaux also testified, recalling Andrea's state of mind, her mood, her behavior while she was there. One nurse testified that in the weeks before the murders that she was there, Andrea kept expressing a need and a desire to go home because she had to be a mother to her children. But when Rusty and the children visited her, I guess Andrea couldn't even make eye contact with her children. This nurse also testified to witnessing Rusty tell Andrea it was, quote, time to hold their baby Mary. The nurse testified that Andrea was so out of it, was so emotionless and like a zombie. She had to physically move Andrea's hands and cup her hands and arms and stuff so she could properly hold the baby. Like she was a doll or something, and had to help her hold the baby. And when staff, protested, Rusty, just brushed them off and said, no, she won't drop the baby. Quote, she was sitting with her hands in her lap. She wouldn't respond to the baby. There was nothing. No look on her face. She never gave the baby eye contact. There was nothing. Another nurse testified that she and a bunch of other nurses and staff believed Andrea could not care for the children at all, especially by herself. Quote, I didn't believe she was able to function and take care of all of those needs on her own. She needed some kind of help. This nurse also described Andrea as, quote, the sickest person I've ever seen in a mental hospital. Dora, Karen, Andrea's siblings, and Rusty, they all testified as well, of course testifying for the defense. They all wanted Andrea to be found not guilty. They wanted her to get proper treatment. And they all testified to what a caring, devoted mother Andrea was. None of her family, her in-laws, her friends wanted to see her put to death. Karen testified to what a, quote, compassionate person her daughter was, saying she was, quote, always thinking of other people, never herself. She was always trying to care for everybody. She spoke to how much Andrea had helped care for her ailing father. Remember, he had succumbed to Alzheimer's. During his testimony, Rusty said Andrea was, quote, wonderful, and, quote, she was so involved with the children. She loved them and read to them. He reiterated her past mental health and contradicted Dr. Starbranch's testimony, saying that she just discouraged them from having more kids. She didn't forbid them. He said they had conceived Mary after Andrea had gotten back to, quote, her old self. Fool, she never got back to her old self. What are you talking about? He also testified that Dr. Starbranch was the one who took Andrea off of her antipsychotic, but Dr. Starbranch has refuted that in her own testimony. Now, when asked why he would send Andrea back to Dr. Saeed if, he wasn't helping her and her condition wasn't improving, according to Rusty's own testimony, he just said, quote, I guess at the time, I saw psychiatrists as the same. They all have diplomas on the wall. It was my mistake. He said Andrea never told him about her hallucinations or her visions, and neither did her doctors. Quote, she kind of described it as a dark period, that she was in a dark place. But according to him, she had never really gone into detail. He really tried to underscore her mental illness again by just sort of reiterating that she was super depressed after Luke's birth, but then was, fine and dandy, but then was depressed again after Mary's birth. He even testified how he and Noah had written a list of things on the board that Andrea could do to cope with her stress, and they had tacked it up on the wall. He also placed emphasis on Andrea's dad's death as being a cause for the depression. Again, this dude just does not get it. And during the trial, Dr. Dietz, remember, testifying for the prosecution, said that shortly before the murders, there was an episode of Law & Order that aired. And in it, a woman drowned her children and successfully got off by arguing not guilty by reason of insanity. And he implied in his testimony that this is where Andrea had gotten the idea to kill her children. And during their closing statements, I don't know if it was Ombie or Williford, but one of the prosecutors straight up said this in their closing arguments, that this is where Andrea had gotten the idea. And just remember that little tidbit because it is relevant. Dr. Saeed testified, and he testified that he observed no psychosis in Andrea in the 2 days that he saw her before the murders. Quote, I did not find any evidence that was available to me that psychosis was playing an important role. He was also described as being, quote, evasive during his testimony. His notes concerning Andrea was also contradictory. Remember, we've talked about this, that Devereaux has a problem with that. There were notes made by him in late May that said Andrea was improving, she was eating and drinking. However, nurses' notes from that same day indicated that Andrea was not eating or drinking and was only drinking enough to swallow her meds. That was it. And another note that was dated May 11th, Dr. Saeed, again, noted that Andrea was improving. However, once again, a nurse's note made on that same day stated Andrea had been found unkempt, sad, and somber. Notes from the next day indicated that she seemed easily distracted, and it appeared as if her judgment was impaired. I don't know if that was a nurse's note or Dr. Saeed's. Dr. Saeed testified how he had put Andrea on the Haldol, but he had tapered it off beginning in June. He said he took her off of it because it seemed to be contributing to her depressive symptoms. Now, it is said Rusty was especially incensed at Dr. Saeed's testimony. I guess he really blamed him for not properly caring for Andrea. He felt he was responsible for not properly recognizing and treating Andrea, not recognizing her deteriorating condition. After all, how could he, Rusty, a medically untrained person like himself, be expected to recognize that? And it's really, fool? Really? severely. Like, maybe that would be a fair argument if you hadn't, like, been pressuring Andrea to get checked out, telling doctors that you knew what was best. Like, okay, dude, get out of here. Again, not that Dr. Saeed is innocent here. Rusty said, quote, "The real question to me is, how could she have been so ill and the medical community not diagnose her, not treat her, and obviously not protect our family from her?" He believed that Andrea had been severely over-medicated under Dr. Saeed, and he was pissed that he had refused to keep Andrea on the Haldol. Again, we talked about this. Rusty thinks Haldol is like this magical cure-all, and Dr. Saeed said that, yeah, he tapered it off because he was also worried about the long-term side effects of Haldol. Like, they're pretty gnarly. But of course, Rusty couldn't really, like, voice his frustration with Dr. Saeed, at least to the public or the press, because he was still under the gag order. But yeah, this is how he was actually feeling. And on March 15th, 2002, after deliberating for less than 4 hours, a jury rejected Andrea's insanity defense and found her guilty. And although the prosecution was going for the death penalty, the jury instead sentenced Andrea to life in prison, and she would be eligible for parole in 40 years. Now, the verdict was very polarizing, right? Some criticized Texas's legal standard for mental illness, saying that it was much too rigid. Others said postpartum depression, women's mental health in general, were not discussed properly or even taken seriously, even in medical circles. There were many who harshly criticized Rusty, believing he did have some blame in the deaths of his children, especially after that little tidbit that Dr. Starbranch had told them that if they had more kids, it was like guaranteed to not end well. And there were also harsh criticisms of his decision to leave Andrea alone with the children, despite being told not to. And of course, there were those who were pissed that Andrea had not been sent to the chair. There were a lot of people that thought she deserved to die. Now, throughout her time in prison, Andrea, of course, was not magically cured of her mental illnesses. In July of 2004, she was actually hospitalized, and this was because she had starved herself for 6 weeks and ended up losing 30 pounds. According to records from the University of Texas Medical Branch Hospital, Andrea believes she saw, quote, "babies yelling for help." It was also said that each year, when the anniversary of her children's murders would come around, her mental state deteriorated even more. And then, on January 6th, 2005, a Texas Court of Appeals reversed Andrea's convictions. And this was because Dr. Park Dietz admitted he had given false testimony regarding that Law & Order episode. So during Andrea's trial, Susan O'Malley, who was an author and was covering the trial for multiple outlets, just so happened to be a former writer for Law & Order. And when Dr. Dietz had said that thing about the Law & Order episode, she immediately knew that wasn't correct, and she reported it. And funnily enough, 2 years after Andrea's trial, in 2004, Law & Order Criminal Intent, I guess, did air an episode that was based on Andrea's case. Now, the Court of Appeals had found that the jury in the original trial might have been influenced by Dr. Dietz's testimony, and therefore, a whole new trial would have to take place. And I believe the prosecutor also explicitly saying that in their closing arguments also lended to the Court of Appeals saying, sorry guys, like, you need to do this all from scratch now. And on January 9th, 2006, Andrea once again entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. She had the same attorneys, the same prosecutors, and the same judge. And a month later, on February 1st, she was released on $200,000 bond on the condition she be admitted to a mental health facility, specifically Rusk State Hospital. The prosecutors had actually wanted her bond to be $1 million, but yeah, Judge Hill had obviously not done that. Now, Judge Hill told Andrea that she could not force her to admit herself to the hospital, but she did tell her, like, I'm setting your bond based on you turning yourself into Rusk State Hospital and staying there until your trial. Andrea's second trial would begin June 22nd, 2006, which is when jury selection would begin, and opening statements began on the 26th. Andrea's trial would last throughout the month of July, and the evidence was pretty much the same presented as the first trial. The only difference now was, now we're 4 years after her first trial, and the perception of mental illness in general had changed. Also different from her first trial was Andrea was not even eligible for the death penalty. Apparently, since the prosecution was not bringing forth any new evidence, and the first jury had rejected the death penalty, I guess the prosecution couldn't ask for the death penalty this time around. I thought that was interesting. The defense maintained Andrea was, of course, mentally unwell, was suffering from psychosis, needed treatment in a mental health facility, not incarceration behind bars. Parham talked about her mental problems she had had while behind bars. Quote, "We've got 4 years of mental health records to show she's still severely mentally ill." Prosecution maintained their initial position that Andrea, though mentally unwell, did know the difference between right and wrong. Quote, "Everything I've seen has reaffirmed she was sane at the time she killed her kids." What's at the crux of this case is you can be mentally ill and know right from wrong and be held criminally responsible. This was according to Williford, the prosecutor. Dr. Saeed testified once again reasserting that he had observed no signs of psychosis in Andrea on the 18th. He again reiterated he had taken her off the Haldol, but had kept her on her antidepressants. Once again, his notes were put under the microscope, and once again, the sloppiness at Devereaux kind of showed through. So though he said he didn't observe psychosis in Andrea, I guess he had notes from late May of 2001 where he had noted that she wasn't eating or drinking and wasn't answering questions. And so yeah, I think he was like contradicting that. Like I think someone, I think the defense had pointed that out and be like, well, you say this, but look at your notes, say this. He also denied that in his notes dated June 18th, that he had went in after the fact and added the words, quote, "denied any psychotic symptoms." Someone had added this in darker ink after the fact, and no one knew who, and Dr. Saeed said that it was not him. Remember, at Devereaux, we said people don't communicate, they sign off on stuff willy-nilly. Dr. Saeed reiterated that he had advised Rusty not to leave Andrea unattended with the children, and Dr. Saeed said it wasn't until he was on the phone with Rusty as news of the murders was breaking that he found out Rusty had been leaving Andrea alone with the children. Now, in the middle of her second trial, there was a medical watchdog group that criticized the makers of one of the antidepressants that Andrea was on, the makers of Effexor. Turns out one of the side effects of this drug was homicidal thoughts and ideation. Now, the warning had only been applied to this drug in 2005 as a rare side effect. Now, per the FDA, it's the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, a rare side effect is when this affects 1 in 1,000 patients. A doctor, Dr. Moira Dolan, she was with the medical watchdog group that called this out. The medical watchdog group was called the Medical Accountability Network. And Dr. Dolan criticized the addition of this rare side effect on Effexor. And she and the group were criticizing it because the makers had added this side effect in such like a down low, not really publicly disclosing it kind of way. They were criticizing that the makers hadn't even sent out any notice to like doctors, nurses, pharmacists, or anything like that. And they just really tried to downplay that they were adding this. She said, quote, "Families don't know to be aware of this possible side effect. As doctors, we're not going to look through 36 pages of labeling." Yeah, they had just kind of thrown it in there. So again, prosecution was asserting Andrea was not legally insane at the time that she killed her children. They even tried to pin spousal revenge as the motive as to why she killed her children. Despite all the defense experts, including Dr. Resnick, testifying that there was no evidence at all to support that. And even the original jury who thought Andrea was legally aware of her actions had also disagreed that her motive was spousal revenge. Dr. Dietz testified for the prosecution again, reasserted his belief Andrea was not legally insane. He cited the Texas insanity law and said that it requires that a delusional person acting under orders from God be judged not guilty by reason of insanity, but that a delusional person acting under orders under Satan be considered sane. He believed Andrea knew that drowning her kids upon command of someone, quote, "without moral authority," such as Satan, was wrong, and thus she did not qualify for not guilty by insanity. And apparently what makes this extra interesting is apparently in another case, Dr. Dietz testified to the opposite of this. Dr. Michael Wellner was a forensic psychiatrist, and he evaluated Andrea in May of 2006. He testified that he believed Andrea did not kill her children in order to save them, but because she was overwhelmed and felt inadequate as a mother. He said though she was psychotic on the day of the murders, he found examples of how she knew killing her children was wrong. All of Andrea's doctors and psychiatrists once again testified for the defense just like they had in her first trial. And it is said during her second trial when the prosecution showed the crime scene video, so it showed the dead children on the bed, it showed Noah floating there in the bathtub, it is said Andrea, like, teared up and, like, couldn't really watch the screen. Like, she became very emotional. And after 13 hours of deliberation over the course of 3 days, on July 26th, 2006, Andrea was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution decided not to go after Andrea for the deaths of Luke and Paul. Remember, she was only charged with the murders of Noah, John, and Mary. And though he had divorced her by this time, Rusty was in attendance during Andrea's second trial, as was her family, and they all shed tears of happiness when she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Rusty said of the verdict, quote, "This means a woman who we perceive to be also a victim in all this, just like our children are, is going to get a better quality of life for herself for the balance of her life." And like with the first trial's jury, this jury had not been informed that if they found Andrea not guilty, it didn't mean she'd walk up into the sunset. She would be remanded to a mental health facility, which I don't understand why juries can't be informed of that. Andrea was then committed to the North Texas State Hospital Vernon campus, where, remember, she would make headlines for becoming friends with Dina Schlosser. In January of 2007, Andrea was transferred to the Kerrville State Hospital, which was a low-security mental facility in Kerrville. And Andrea has been in this hospital ever since then. And every year, she can, like, have this hearing, right, that determines whether she is, like, mentally competent enough to, you know, go live in society. And every year, she declines to have this review and opting instead just to stay in the facility. Parnham, remember, her lawyer, said he still keeps in contact with Andrea to this day, and that she is, quote, happy in the facility. Quote, "She's where she wants to be, where she needs to be." He told reporters in 2021 that Andrea often watches the home videos she took of her children. She spends time making crafts, things like aprons, cards, and other gifts, and she even sells them anonymously online. The money goes to the Yates Children Memorial Fund, which was founded by Parnham and his wife Mary, and is dedicated to women's mental health, particularly postpartum mental health. And as of April 2022, Andrea had declined yet another annual review hearing, opting instead to stay where she's at. Parnham stays in regular contact with her and said that he looks on her as if she's a daughter. It seems like Parnham and his wife has sort of, like, somewhat unofficially adopted Andrea, and they keep in contact with her. And real quick, let's get into Rusty. So on August 3rd, 2004, Rusty filed for divorce from Andrea, and their divorce would be finalized in March of 2005. He then remarried a fellow Clear Lake churchgoer named Laura Arnold on March 18th, 2006. And he had a son with her. However, it looks like Laura filed for divorce from Rusty in 2015, so his kid was like 7 or 8 or so. In a 2015 interview with Oprah, Rusty claimed that he visited Andrea once a year and phoned her once a month. And when Oprah asked him if he forgave her, he said, quote, "Yes, forgiveness kind of implies that I have ever really blamed her. In some sense, I've never really blamed her because I've always blamed her illness." He said Andrea was a, quote, "caring, loving mother who would never have otherwise harmed our children in any way had she not been mentally ill." And apparently Andrea had asked him at one point in time, like, how he had forgive her. And I guess he had told her, quote, "Andrea, if I were in a car driving the 5 children and I had a heart attack and had a wreck and they all died, would you blame me? Would it be my fault? That's the same thing with you. You're mentally ill. It's a brain sickness." Not sure if he still visits or calls Andrea to this day. Not sure. The latest update I could find was from 2015 when he sat down with Oprah and when his second wife filed for divorce. And I'm not sure of Rusty's view on mental illness now. Apparently, during Andrea's trials, he, attended anti-death penalty rallies. He was attending a lot of, like, rallies and stuff that were talking about, mental health awareness and stuff. So I would like to think he's learned a lot since then, hopefully. And yeah, that was Andrea Yates. I ended up reading this book for the case called Breaking Point. It's by a New York Times author, Susie Spencer. I believe it just goes to, like, the end of her first trial or something. I don't know, this book was okay. I don't know why some true crime books, like, have to jump around everywhere. Like, I'd say, like, the first I don't know, like maybe quarter of this book, the first like few chapters. It was actually kind of hard to get into because it just jumped around everywhere. Like it started with the day of the murders and then it like kept jumping back and forth, jumping to different people. So I hate when true crime books do that. Like just tell the story from A to B, man. But yeah, I mean, it was okay. I got a lot of useful information out of it, but yeah, I don't know. It was okay. And as far as my thoughts on Rusty, like I said, so complicated because on the one hand, he's a jackass, right? Like his thoughts on depression and mental health, like before all this, like really pissed me off. Like not gonna lie, that really grinded my gears. I really hope he's learned a lot because like his arrogance before this regarding mental health and all that is just astounding, really, you know, thinking that Haldol is sort of like this cure-all, thinking that Andrea had been cured after giving birth to Luke and thinking that she had been healed enough to then conceive another child. Like, nah, especially when I read that Andrea had told that doctor that Rusty had sort of, you know, pressured her into sex to conceive Mary. Like, nah, that really pissed me off. But on the other hand, I do respect how much he stood by her, how he kept, you know, trying to combat this vitriolic hate that people were really lobbing towards her. So I think that's why I have such complicated feelings with Rusty, is like at least he stuck by her, and by attending anti-death penalty rallies and mental health rallies, I really hope he opened his mind more. I'm glad he distanced himself from Michael and Rachel. I'm sorry, but like they're wackadoodles. And yeah, I'm actually curious to know, like, what do you guys think of Rusty? Like, I know online some people like hate his guts. They freaking hate him, dude. And a lot of people thought it was super inappropriate that he got remarried and had another kid. And yeah, I don't know what to think about that. I was certainly shocked. And I was certainly shocked when he had another kid. Like, I don't know. What do you guys think? I really would love to know what you guys think. And yeah, man, like with the Dina Schlosser case, I just feel like this case is sad all the way around. I feel so sorry for those poor, sweet little children, especially Noah. I mean, he was like 7, you know? So I bet you him and John probably knew like what was happening. And it's just so sad. I feel so sad for Andrea, like suffering from that. Like to have your mind go against you like that. God, that blows. Like, that's frightening. Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for indulging me and letting me get really deep down into this case. Definitely a case I've always wanted to do a deep dive into, and yeah, that's what I decided to do for my birthday. Also, real quick, I haven't really mentioned it, but also wanted to say thank you so much for over 900 subscribers. Like, what the hell? Like, that completely blows me away. So thank you so much. Thank you for your comments. I do get to them. I promise. I'm so sorry I'm delayed. Guys, when I get into research or when I get into editing, I'm not kidding. Like, I can sit there and do that for like 6, 7, 8 hours and just not have any concept of time or what's going on. But I promise I will get to your comments. Thank you so much for commenting. Thank you for watching my dumb ass. And yeah, thank you for listening to me ramble on. Please tell me your thoughts about this case. Totally want to hear what you guys think. I honestly think Rusty and Dr. Saeed, the whole Devereaux Center, honestly, they all have, I feel a hand in what happened, you know, in addition to Andrea. But that's just me personally. What do you guys think? What do you think of Rusty's culpability, Dr. Saeed's, Devereaux's? What about Michael and Rachel? Do they have any culpability in your mind? Please tell me your thoughts. And, oh boy, I will let you go. I'm tired of hearing my own voice. I'm sure you're tired of hearing it. We will be back next week with Crime Dive. It's a requested case. That is what we're going to finish November out with, is some requested cases. And wow, the case that I have for you guys next week is like honestly a nightmare, and is probably a nightmare for countless women. I mean, countless people, honestly, but especially women living alone. Yeah, it's creepy. So yeah, until next week, you know, take care of yourself out there. Have a safe and happy week. Remember, don't be a douche. douche, dude. Just don't be a prick, all right? Just be a decent person. Like, you never know the battle someone's going through. We just spent, 2 weeks going over exactly that. Andrea was going through a lot of struggles that a lot of people were not totally aware of. So yeah, just don't be a D-bag, all right? Don't be a dick, all right? Will Wheaton has it right. Alrighty, y'all. Until next week. Bye-bye.